So there's competition. So you see how important experience is to actually determining whether or not the infant's going to see. And they have to do it quickly because in a relatively short period of time, this area will be taken over, and even if the eye has normal vision, it won't be able to connect. The thing with this experiment, though, they were wondering what happens if we force those nerves to go over here to what's called the auditory or the hearing cortex. What would happen? And they were able to actually interpret the results based upon different angles of formation on a device they were using to actually connect the visual imprint on the optic nerve itself. So they had some oblique, angles, and those are encoded in red. The vertical ones are encoded in blue, then the green ones are oblique, and the horizontal ones are in yellow. So if we take a look then at this question, can nurture trump what nature intended? And this experiment was a classic that actually examined that whole thing. Is the volume up? The sound up?
To answer that question, neuroscientists turned to a small animal immortalized in a portrait by Leonardo da Vinci over 500 years ago. The ferret.
The most fundamental question in understanding how the brain develops has to be the interaction between nature and nurture. We know that the brain has different areas that do different things, such as the visual cortex at the back of the brain, or the auditory cortex in the middle of the brain. How do these areas get to be where they are, and how do they do what they end up doing in the adult?
How plastic is the brain? How flexible? Can nurture trump what nature intended? In a series of elegant experiments, neuroscientist Mriganka Sir restructured the brains of newborn ferrets. In the normal ferret, light striking the eye creates electrical waves that travel to the visual cortex. Sir rewired the ferret's brain, hooking up the eyes to the auditory cortex, showering the hearing parts of the brain with electric waves generated by the light.
We reasoned that if we can make visual inputs from the eye go to the auditory cortex that normally processes hearing, would the hearing cortex now become like a visual cortex or a seeing cortex if it grew up with vision rather than with audition? Would the hearing cortex now come to have the same circuits and connections that mark the visual cortex? If it doesn't, then nature or the genetic endowment is of the essence. If it does, then the inputs are important or nurture is important, then the animal would see.
By recording a series of images directly from the brains of his rewired ferrets, Sir provided evidence that the ferrets could see. With normal ferrets, the activity of the neurons in the visual cortex takes on a characteristic pinwheel shape. With the rewired ferrets, the auditory cortex describes a similar pinwheel design. The brain has been transformed, but not entirely.
Instead of 20/20 vision, they will have, let's say, 20/60 vision, meaning that they see at 20 feet what a normal ferret would see at 60 feet.
The characteristic pinwheel is still there, but it is less orderly, slurred. Environment shapes the brain, but can't completely change genetic destiny.
Our experiments demonstrate beautifully, I think, the interaction of nature and nurture. I believe that the environment writes on a developing brain, but does not write on a blank slate. there is a structure that comes about due to genes, which then is influenced further by the environment that the brain is developing in. Our experiments provide very clear evidence of the remarkable plasticity of the brain.
All right, so we know that nurturing is important in early development, and what effect does it have on someone who is immersed in a terrifying, violent, extremely deprivational kind of environment that actually goes counter to the way in which the brain is designed to interact with other human beings. There's probably, if you were looking at the psychopathology of it, you would probably say there is no other kind of activity that is more destructive of the circuitry in the brain that's supposed to be the natural circuitry that endows us with the capacity for empathy and care and compassion, kindness, etc. So, how many of you have seen the TV program or heard of the TV program The Sopranos? So, I've heard of it. I never watched it. But I was interested in the death of James Gandolfini, who was the Godfather. There were 2 movies that came surfacing that he was the executive director of. One was Alive Memories, Home from Iraq. The fight has just begun. The other one was War Torn, that traced the history of post-traumatic stress disorder from the Civil War all the way through to interviews that he actually did in Iraq with people on active duty. And they described to him, explained to him, the kind of treatment they were getting and how it wasn't helping, and they just wanted to get out of there and get back home and get into a setting and environment that wasn't so stressful and damaging, toxic. This is a toxic environment. You can't find a more toxic environment than a war zone. Okay, so it's after Vietnam where they were finding that the Agent Orange that was used in Vietnam was the same herbicide that was being sold for people to kill the weeds in their lawn. So it would kill dandelions, but it wouldn't kill the grass because one was a dicotyledon and the other was a monocotyledon, and this particular herbicide could distinguish the difference between it. So it wasn't the 2,4-D and 2,4-T that were causing the problems, which are the 2 active chemicals in most of the agents you put on your lawn to control your weeds. It was as a result of the manufacture of both of these products that there was a toxin produced that turned out to be the most toxic substance that was known to man at the time. It was called dioxin. Now that's in your weed control too. And when they checked it out, the concentration of dioxin in the herbicides that they used in Vietnam was 10,000 times higher than what was being used for home lawn care. So what they were thinking about is, well, we don't care about the Vietnamese. We don't care about the North Vietnamese or the South Vietnamese. But what they neglected to care about was the health consequences to the Marines and Air Force pilots that were flying the planes that were spraying the herbicide, to the Army, to anyone that was involved in Vietnam. So I was there in 67 and 68. I went back in 1992 and spent some time in Ho Chi Minh City, which used to be Saigon, and also in Hanoi, as well as at a base just along the DMZ, which is the base where I was actually stationed when I was in the Marine Corps. It was an area where we had put in innumerable landmines. And so the first part of my journey was 2 weeks in the Mekong Delta, which I was never near, but it was with Heifer International. And if you're familiar with Heifer International, it's an international organization that raises animals through a veterinary hospital usually, and then takes the animals and distributes them to poor rural farmers. So for us, it was taking cows out to rural farmers, and they try to make sure that the cow is actually pregnant. And these are all managed at the veterinary hospital, veterinary school, veterinary medicine in Saigon. So, I mean, they're healthy, and they train the peasants and the farmers how to actually care for the animal, how to feed it, how to make sure it has its immunizations, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where I spent 2 weeks with my wife, Karen. She, was a intensive care nurse, and she had to go back home to go to work. But I went up to the base where it was actually Dong Ha was the city, and the base that was outside that was just totally excoriated. There was absolutely nothing but red clay you could see, and I was involved with a group called Peace Trees Vietnam that was doing reforestation, because they found that the canopy of the vegetation in Vietnam was necessary in order to increase the humidity over the rice paddies so they would get good yields from the rice that they were growing. And then they were also doing demining. And it was ironic because it was also sorrowful in the sense that I knew that those mines were mines that the units that were there, including ours, placed in the ground. And that they were still pulling them out of the ground, and they were still getting injuries and deaths from unexploded ordnance. So the first thing we did when we got there was the next morning we were supposed to go out and help plant trees. And there were some young students that were involved in this, junior high and early senior high. And so you're wondering what's going to happen when you go out and here you are. So, we walk out into the field and they kind of start to gather around you. And the first question they ask, have you ever been to Vietnam? And when you say yes, they say, you were here for the American War. They don't call it the Vietnam War, they call it the American War. And I didn't know if I could, first of all, I had all kinds of perceptions about how I would respond to this. They knew, because you were there doing what you were doing, that you were a different person than when you were there in 67 and 68. And they expressed, both by touch and by sight, because we couldn't really understand the language, just by looking into your face, that you were forgiven. I mean, this is an outpouring of compassion that was unimaginable. So all your fear and anxiety just dissipates, simply because you know that this individual somehow is interpreting your presence here as reconciliation, as a way of showing the Vietnamese people that you care about them. But they had transformed that whole base into a combination rubber plantation, coffee plantation, and pepper plantation. And the pepper I'm talking about is the condiment. There's a tree in Vietnam that, as it gets old, it sheds its overstory. So all you see is this like straight trunk sticking up out of the ground. And so they would dig a ditch around it and put buffalo dung in there, water buffalo dung, and then put pepper seeds in there, the condiment pepper. And then that pepper plant would completely entwine the tree, the trunk of the tree, so it looked like another tree almost. So they had really developed that area that if you came there, you wouldn't realize the destruction and devastation that was there before, or unless you knew that they were in fact involved in demining operations that were still going on there. So I just want to show you a little piece of this movie that Gandolfini was the executive director of. He interviewed a number of veterans, and what he did was just talk to them about their experiences. And he was incredible in the sense that he would just kind of lay back, and the person that directed it said that he never saw anyone be able to develop such rapport with individuals as Gandolfini was able to, because they recognized him as the Godfather. He's like their friend, because they had seen him on TV, and so they were really open with him. So we'll just do the first one. I think it takes about 3 or 4 minutes. But this just gives you some idea what these vets coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan have to deal with once they get home. Laces. Wait for the slate, please. Wait for the slate.
And you're going to be facing straight ahead.
Everyone I've talked to knows the exact date when they've been hit.
Yeah, it's burned into your memory.
Yeah, a live day. September 21st of 04 is when I got hit. But I guess it depends on how you consider it, because there's 3 times they tried flying me out, and all 3 times I died on a helicopter.
I feel like I'm not supposed to be here. My best friend was behind the driver, and he lost his life.
I always somehow see my picture on there where it should be January 2nd, 2005. Specialist Dexter, or PLC Dexter in Pitts, killed in Baghdad.
I wake up and I thank God that I'm actually alive, and I pat myself on the back. I survived another day.
I mean, how many people can look at you and say, you know, I just stared down with death and I won. You know, and I got a second chance.
You know, you're just happy that you're alive.
I want to thank you for everything you've done. I admire you for that. And for coming here.
Very welcome.
Thank you.
Everybody always says if this, you know, were going to happen, it couldn't have happened to a better person.
Hailing out of 1st Platoon, the 411th MP Company. Standing about 5'4", 125 pounds soaking wet. Anderson! Specialist Anderson, the 0.5s.
Tell me what happened first.
It was probably around 11 when it actually happened. I was driving, and me and my team leader, his name's Penney, we always sit there and talk and bullshit and, you know, make fun of everything that we're doing and, you know, just trying to keep a sense of humor so we keep our mind off being scared.
So wait, how are you feeling today on this wonderful day?
Just great knowing that our wonderful platoon sergeants coming back to make their life a living hell today.
Yes, I cannot wait either.
And if I remember correctly, I was smoking. I had my left hand on the steering wheel. I was smoking, and then the bomb went off. I didn't hear it, but I saw it, like the flash and the smoke and the fire coming through the door. And I realized we got hit, so I was like, oh, we got hit. And then I had blood on my face and the flies were landing all over my face, so I wiped my face to get rid of the flies, and that's when I noticed that my fingertip was gone. So I was like, oh, okay. And that's when I started really assessing myself. I was like, all right, that's not bad. And then I turned my hand over. I noticed like this piece of, this chunk of my hand was gone. So I was like, okay, still not bad. I can live with that. And then when I went to wipe the flies with my face again with my left hand, there was nothing there. So that's when I was like, oh, that's gone. And then I looked down and I saw that my legs were gone. And then they had kind of forced my head back to the ground so that hoping that I wouldn't see,
What was your immediate reaction to that?
Well, I was just kind of like, oh, shit. This is, obviously my left leg. That's what I have left of it. This one's a lot shorter than my other one. And this is the surgery mark, and then all down here is the actual, sewing line from the injury. They folded it up and put it there. And then my arm just kind of goes into the socket to about here.
And your hand? What's that? Do that again?
I can spin it all the way around. I can open and close it, and that's pretty much all it does.
Can you take my hand? Would that be a problem?
No, because I'm...
Well, you can control that very well.
Yeah, pretty much. If I didn't have my hand, if I lost both my hands, I really think, it wouldn't be worth it to be around. Only because to have both your legs gone and both your hands gone would be 1,000 times more difficult.
Maybe a sensation of touch, too, in a sense.
Right. Well, I can't feel these 3 fingers either.
Well.
But it's slowly coming back, so I'm very hopeful. But I can still pick up a fork and feed myself and clean myself up in the shower or whatever.
So it's about being independent.
Yeah, it has to do a lot with being independent.
Have you heard about that? A lot of people have said that you now have 2 birthdays.
Yes, the alive day.
The day that you were born and the day that you almost died and you were alive.
Right.
Do you have any feelings on that? Or?
For right now, I'm sure it'll change in the future. But for right now, I feel that your alive day, everybody makes a big deal about it, especially at Walter Reed, all the therapists, and they're like, oh, it's your alive day, congratulations. And I can see their point, that you would want to celebrate something like that. But from my point of view, it's like, okay, well, we're sitting here celebrating the worst day of my life. Great. Let's just remind me of that every year. I don't know.
What day was, what was the day?
October 23rd of 2005.
All right. 40 surgeries in 13 months. I can't even imagine what it's like to go through something like that. But this is one of the consequences of these wars, especially with the IEDs. I don't know how Gandolfini did it, but he had insurgent footage, that shows the Humvee going down the road and then detonating an IED. But we'll entertain any questions you have about that maybe later on, but let me just go through some more information here about the potential that human beings have of being empathic to the extreme. In other words, their willingness to suffer without the desire for retaliation. Okay? This is a hard thing. That's a lifetime effort. So here's an example of written language. 5,000 years ago in the Middle East. Yet, human beings had the genetic potential for 200,000 years prior to the first invention of written language. And if we read some of the more current anthropological literature, what they're saying, archaeological literature, that we had that capacity, we had that empathic capacity like built into our genome way back. Not just a million years, but maybe as many as 30 million or 29 million or 27. You know, it was there because of the dynamics of the small band gather hunter groups and the social interactions that they had with one another. Another is reading. 1,000 years ago, 1% of the population of Western Europe could read, and now almost everyone can read. It's universal, but it's universal public education that made that possible. So we have genes. We have genes that we can express. We have genes that actually control our behaviors, depending upon what that gene is developing as far as the brain is concerned or our peripheral nervous system is concerned. And we just assume that because of the dominant effect of not only religious organizations, but also the evolutionary psychology that's out there now, saying that we are innately mean and greedy and violent and aggressive, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things the most recent book did from this field of study, anthropology, archaeology, was that it definitively proved there was no such thing as a war gene. You know, Steven Pinker wrote a book, Our Better Angels, a couple years ago, and that's one of the things that he was talking about. We have a war gene. And there is no such thing. Absolutely no such thing. And this is an example of what can happen if you deprive someone of experiences. So I don't know if you can read that or not, but if not, I'll just go through it quickly and just summarize what's there. And there were studies that isolated infants, normal infants, and deprived them of certain experiences. And this particular one was language. So eventually, when people realized how disastrous it was, they called it the forbidden experience, simply because of the exceptional deprivation of ordinary human contact it requires. And we'll take a look at Frederick in a minute, but he raised, well, he didn't raise them himself, but he had foster mothers and nurses raise children and deprive the children of language, and we'll see the results of that particular experiment are concerned. So he labored in vain, and one of the reasons for that was because, you know, the kids weren't receiving any kind of feedback. So you know how we clap for our grandkids or even our older kids at a sporting event, and you know, have all kinds of hand gestures that indicate, you know, what we're feeling or how we want to interact. And the gladness, you know, blandishments, you know, these praises we lavish on our children or people we love. So it was eventually concluded that speech arose from hearing human speech. And if you couldn't hear human speech, you would be mute. But this comes from a little background research we did after we had conducted a veterans end-of-life stories study. We did it in conjunction with the University of Delaware and Delaware Hospice. And I was volunteering for Delaware Hospice at the time, and they wanted to know if I would kind of spearhead this because I was a vet. So we started looking at what effect, I mean, this is what they wanted to know, what effect would telling their story have on end-of-life experiences for the vet? Would he feel more peaceful? Would he feel he had resolved conflicts? Would he possibly heal wounds between himself and other members of his family or friends, et cetera, et cetera? So when we started looking at the literature,